Personally, I think that Ben Jonson is far more interesting than William Shakespeare. This is because he has clear opinions.
And now, class, we cover what Shakespeare thought of story structure. He was for the 5-act story structure.
Me.
Yes?
So, what proof do you have that Shakespeare thought those things?
Well, I was told by my professor before me, and so it must be correct.
But I heard that even the first folio is a copy of his plays and stuff. So, what did he write about story structure?
Mr. English, do you need help? 안녕하세요, 김윤미입니다. Hello, I'm Yumi Kim, your fantastic but not quite all-knowing guide to world literature. A few notes up front. In this episode, I refer to a lot of video and video clips, but if I include the actual video clips, the BBC is likely to give me a copyright strike. So instead, I include references to the video and quote them word for word. If there's links, I'll include them in the description box below. So in this episode, we're going to cover the gap from Elias Donatus to about the 19th century and why very little probably happened in that time period about story structure. That means that we're going to cover William Shakespeare. For this episode, I decided against a lot of academic texts because most of them would be paywalled. And I want to give people who have no access to a college library the ability to check my sources. For the snobby academics who look down on people because they do not use academic texts, this does not mean that I cannot back my assertions without academic texts. However, appearing as a snobby academic is less important than information dissemination. That said, I mainly focused on English language texts because the conflict narrative mostly comes from the interaction of the US and the UK with each other. This does not mean that I do not know other texts from Europe from the same time period.
But Gutenberg and the printing press.
Oh, Johannes Gutenberg. You mean the guy that invented the
Adjustable type mold?
so that you could get novels, trade paperback, hardcovers, in different sizes, even greeting cards. Oh my god.
But the printing press itself.
Ah, you mean China from the first millennium CE? The Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist book from Dunhuang, China, 868 CE?
Movable type.
Ah, that's the Chinese inventor in 1140 CE. B. Schenk, who lived from 940 CE to 1051 CE. He used clay for his type, right? And then Wang Zhen made wooden movable type in 1297 CE.
No, Gutenberg invented metal movable type.
That was Koreans in the 13th century, Goryeo. And the likely inventor is Master Cho Yuni. And Jikji was the first book printed with metal movable type, likely typeset by Master Im Inho. You mean him, right? You do know that Johannes Gutenberg likely stole the invention from Chinese Uyghurs, who are Muslim, and you, as a white person, should be very grateful to the Islamic Empire. But people forget his real invention
Adjustable type mold?
and then attribute to him other inventions from people of color.
But I ask you, what is not sexy
about an adjustable type mold. It can create type of different sizes, and therefore books of different sizes, oversized books, novels, and trade paperbacks. You can adjust the type spacing. Oh, yes! Yes! Okay, maybe it's a turn on that only typographers and graphic designers understand. How else are you going to sneak a novel onto a plane and put it into your purse or your bag without adjustable type mold? How are you going to boast to your friends that you have a really rare book with really great pictures if they do not look really big? Adjustable type mold? What is it? Give the man credit for what he actually invented. Adjustable type mold? White people, I say to you, celebrate Gutenberg for what he actually invented. Adjustable type mold? And then give credit to the people of color who actually invented the other things. So let's get back to the main topic. Where was I? Oh yes, William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born 1564 and then died in 1616. This is the person that every white, cis-het, abled man loves to invoke. And sometimes marginalized people too, but you know. This is why they like to say that their story structure was used, or should have been used, by William Shakespeare. I'm looking at you, Freytag. So we need a pit stop to explain William Shakespeare. I think that we can sum this up quickly. William Shakespeare did not invent the 5-act structure. Okay, we're done. Good day. Oh, damn it. I think I have to explain exactly why this is. Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's see where I was. Oh, yes. So usually people explain it this way because of the Black Friars. And as usual in this series, it's not true. You're not shocked. Shakespeare said nothing about his plays beyond what is copied in the first folio. This is the extent of his paratext. Oh, hello, definition wizard. Yes, I could use your help. Could you define paratext for me? Paratext. French literary theorist Gerard Genet's term for the framing devices authors and publishers use to contextualize works and generate interest, e.g. blurbs, subtitles, celebrity endorsements, and so forth. As Genet points out in Zoye, 1987, translated as paratext, Thresholds of Interpretation, 1997, although not officially part of the text, the paratext can have a significant influence over the way a text is received. OxfordReference.com. No, definition wizard. You are not a magical POC to me. You do not give me deep spiritual wisdom. They're just a little upset over me cutting their lines the last 2 episodes. So the best that we can do is take a rough guess by looking at the plays of, say, Ben Jonson, or the plays of Marlowe, and then look at the historical context. But again, taking this as the absolute undeniable truth will create copy errors. Do not do that. The context around Shakespeare might not have mattered as much to him as you might guess. But then, writers do not work in vacuums. Ben Jonson was born June 11th, 1572, and died August 16th, 1637. It's fair to say, given Ben Jonson's body of work, that he influenced William Shakespeare on his comedies. You don't become a writer and then don't become friends with the nearest writer. Ben Jonson's plays were equally popular in Shakespeare's time. The posted plays in the description box below are in 5 acts, such as Every Man and His Humor. But he has the exact same problem as William Shakespeare. None of his plays are the originals. They're all copies. Personally, I think that Ben Jonson is far more interesting than William Shakespeare. This is because he has clear opinions. I also have a theory. This is why he's not studied so much, because people cannot impose on him their opinions so easily. The next writer that we're going to cover as an influence on William Shakespeare is Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was born in 1564 and then died in 1593. He was born only 2 months apart from Shakespeare. He mainly wrote tragic histories, such as Dido, Queen of Carthage, which was written with Thomas Nash. However, like Ben Jonson and Shakespeare, they're not the originals. They're copies. What did the acts contain? We're not certain. Despite that, I'm going to take a rough guess at what the plot driver was in Shakespeare's plays and lay out the thesis for you. William Shakespeare is best known for his plays Romeo and Juliet, As You Like It, Hamlet, and others. There are plenty of surrounding texts that cover histories, which would later become historical fiction, but he was the first to make a sustained number of them. This was said by Andrew Hadfield, University of Sussex, in British History's Biggest Fibs with Lucy Worsley, Episode 1, War of the Roses. Worsley. Shakespeare is really not afraid to use history, to use the past, to make moral points, is he? Good, bad, do it like this, don't do it like that. Andrew Hadfield replies, it's exactly right. History is told and retold because it tells you lessons, because you start to think about things that you might be able to do rather better than last time. Worsley, a cautionary tale. But Worsley and Hadfield both assert the point was not to be historically accurate. Worsley, in the same documentary, states that for Shakespeare and his first audiences, Richard's hunch and his arm and his limp weren't just physical deformities. They believed in the science of physiogamy that suggested your outward appearance reflected your inner self. So if Richard was deformed, he must have had an irredeemably evil soul. It's well covered and known that Shakespeare added witches at James VI's behest. This leaves historians with very little doubt as to why he added witches to Macbeth. Unlike England today, the monarch needed to be pleased and amused, so it wasn't as if one had a choice. Julian Harrison in British History's Biggest Fibs with Lucy Worsley, Episode 1, War of the Roses, covers this with John Roos. John Roos was a historian who was in favor of Richard III and then Henry VII, both respectively in their reigns, but wrote totally different histories. The majority of documentaries that I found about Richard III, the play, talk about how hard Henry Tudor had to work to legitimize his rule. So by the time that Shakespeare came around and was writing plays, he had to capitulate to the state-made story. With years of unrest starting with Henry Tudor, Shakespeare had to please his monarchs. The monarchs wanted to state that they were the correct and moral choice, so Shakespeare's histories had to reinforce that ideology. So let's look at an example from Romeo and Juliet. The prince says at the end of the play, and excuse my bad reading of Shakespeare,
"This letter doth make good the friar's words, their course of love, the tidings of her death." And here he writes that he did buy a poison of a poor apothecary, and therewithal came to this vault to die and lie with Juliet. Where be these enemies? Capulet, Montague, see what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love, and I, for winking at your discords too, have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished.
and if that's not moralizing, I don't know what is. Also, in the time of William Shakespeare, many ideas about philosophy and science came from Aristotle. Aristotle was popular for explaining medicine, such as the humor system, and of course, what a play should and should not be. As we covered in a previous episode, Aristotle, for tragedies in particular, was for morality taught through negative reinforcement. If you take a purview of the histories of the time, this seems to be true of Elizabeth Tudor. Everybody who was in the way of her taking the throne was considered deeply immoral. Shakespeare has his father, his mother, his sister, his wife, and 2 daughters to support, so he cannot afford to be thrown in jail. And Shakespeare likely had a memory of this because of Ben Jonson, his friend. Ben Jonson and Thomas Nash were jailed in 1597 for writing the play Isle of Dogs. Queen Elizabeth I was not amused. I doubt that Shakespeare wanted to be jailed. So moralizing that the monarch is the correct choice to keep your family who is in Stratford-on-Avon, who is now poor, is probably better. It makes no sense to encourage conflict as a monarch. Do people remember monarchs for how much conflict that they have in a good way? No, people remember good monarchs by how peaceful they were, and you don't want to encourage rival factions. The point is, if Shakespeare is going to have a plot driver for his histories and his tragedies, it's likely going to be morals, not conflict. Shakespeare, for most of his plays, preaches at you beginning to end. So let's get back to the main topic. Shakespeare had no intended act structure for his plays that we know of. It was imposed at a later date. This is also true of his contemporaries. So we aren't sure, and we don't know who imposed all of these 5-act structures on all of these plays. There's no attribution for who split the plays this way, or what their reasoning was for this structure. In addition, there were plays of different act numbers and structures, such as the play Fortunae Ludiberium Civ Balsarius, which was written in 1651. This play has a 4-act structure, which is prostasis, epistasis, katasis, and catastrophe. You'll remember this from the previous episode about Elias Donatus, who had protosis, epitosis, and catastrophe. Ken Elias didn't really want that act structure because he was studying the plays of Terence. He wanted a 5-act structure. Copy error. Another source says that Shakespeare's plays were made 5 acts in post. With no paratext, we can hypothesize maybe Horace became popular. Ben Jonson did translate him. But then again, Ben Jonson does not leave behind any writings about why he wrote his plays as he did. But remember what I also said. The Tudors wanted to feel connected to the Greeks and Romans so they could explain how great their civilization was. So this is the best guess that we've got. So there's a huge span between Shakespeare and the 20th century that we have to kind of cover in between. There's not a lot that happens, so I've condensed it down. So we have to cover the Enlightenment and the rise of the printing press in Europe. With the rise of the printing press, mainly rich people could spread information more readily. This led to thinkers and philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, René Descartes, John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So if you want to know more about these people, I would suggest to go to Philosophy Tube with Abigail Thorne. She's not paying me. She's not even aware of my existence, but I think she has really good content. These people did have an influence on stories, but not story structure, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas of innocence in children, which influenced the division between the children's section and the adult section today. But the key text that we're going to kind of work around but not explain is John Locke's Concerning Human Understanding, which was published in 1690. John Locke's philosophy shows up in Gothic novels such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which was published in 1764 and allowed writers to center on character over events. John Locke's philosophy allowed people to develop the idea of sensibility, which posited that the center of all humanity is emotion. From here, I admit that I took some references from the BBC series A Very British Romance with Lucy Worsley, which is still available in Britain. However, I could not find a good quote from her to give credit for pulling those sources. Still, if you can find the documentary, it's very good. Just be sure to check the dates of the works mentioned. They did a little bit of fudging in order to make the story a little bit more cohesive. Also popular in the 1700s were letter writing manuals, such as the really long titled Letters to and for Particular Friends on the Most Important Occasions, directing not only in the correct style and forms to be observed in justly and prudently. So putting all these thinkers together, they create the democratization of ideas and government, which brings us to the 19th century. The 18th century debates about sense or sensibility continue with thinkers such as John Ruskin, who was born in 1819 and died in 1900. He was famous for leading the pre-Raphaelite movement in art. The painter that best exemplifies how ridiculous this movement could get is William Holman Hunt's The Scapegoat. God, so ridiculous. In literature, John Ruskin is best known for championing the realism movement. Hey, definition wizard. Yeah. Could you help me with the definition of literary realism? Thanks. Literary realism, broadly defined as the faithful representation of reality or verisimilitude. Realism is a literary technique practiced by many schools of writing. Although strictly speaking, realism is a technique, it also denotes a particular kind of subject matter, especially the representation of middle-class life, a reaction against romanticism, an interest in scientific method, the systematizing of the study of documentary history, and the influence of rational philosophy all affected the rise of realism. Written by Donna M. Campbell, Washington State University, 2013. I'm going to return to this later, but first we have to cover a secondary movement happening in technology. The cost of paper, metal, and printing was really high in Europe until very late into the industrial age. Kai Lun invented reinforced paper in 105 CE. However, the process of refining paper and metal manufacturing takes a while to develop. It wasn't until 1690 that the first paper mill was built in Pennsylvania, the United States. However, it took a while to refine the process of making paper, and it was still expensive. Early printing was one page at a time, which cost a ton of money. It wasn't until 1843 that the rotary printing press was invented by William March Hoe, an American inventor. The rotary printing press was significantly improved by William Bullock in 1863. So now we're firmly in the 19th century. School became compulsory for 0 to 5-year-olds in the 1880s, and then the required age for mandatory school attendance rose thereafter. That meant that the general population's literacy rate became better. And then there was more market for books and there were more writers. The explosion point about writing and reading came in the very late 1800s, where finally reading and writing were widely taught. Therefore, there would have been more discourse about how to properly write books and scripts. Also, the cost of printing had significantly dropped. This meant that there were a ton of new writers who were debating back and forth about how to write for the masses instead of a select elite. The writing from this era seems to be mixed between morality tales, sensibility, and sense. For example, there's the documentary Victorians Uncovered, The Perfect Marriage, which was made in 2001, which says of George Eliot, "I know she is not a man, but I'm making a point," that her first book, Adam Bede, was a morality tale, and that she continued to make morality tales. But then there were the sensibility writers, mostly led at this late stage by John Ruskin. I admit to kind of skipping over reading him because he's really prolific. And then there were increased ideas about logic, such as from Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who created the genre known as science fiction. Though most hardcore science fiction fans will know that there's a lot of morality tales in science fiction. Jules Verne is the first science fiction writer. Stop giving it to H.G. Wells. Thus, the plot driver was a little bit more free, so writers could choose whatever they wanted per the story that they were writing, as indicated by the documentary Victorians Uncovered. Some people think that people will be confused if you keep changing out the plot driver. But doesn't this diversity of thought argue against that? We know the difference between George Eliot's morality tales and maybe John Ruskin's realism. Now you may be thinking, okay, so there were a bunch of writers discussing at this time period, but what about in William Shakespeare's period? This does not mean that the craft of writing was not discussed before, but was never really published. But it would be hard to divine that they would say that a plot should be like this, a character should be like this, and different elements should be like this. Still, many historians and writers would kill to be in the room with Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and Shakespeare, like Stephen Fry, who said this in Planet Word, episode 5. Some writers think that keeping the writer mysterious is important, so they will burn their own writings, such as Jane Austen, the Brontes, many modernists and contemporary writers today. Others were completely lost, such as Lord Byron's diaries, which makes historians and literary scholars cry. The most that we can hope from this time period is corrections to manuscripts, such as Mary Shelley's husband's corrections to Frankenstein. So from the end of Shakespeare, which we know a little about, to about the 19th century, there is a gaping hole where we don't know that much because there isn't a lot of writing about how writers should write. Maybe there's some lost journals and works somewhere that we have yet to find that discusses story structure. But then in the next 150 years, they're going to try to retcon the last 400 to make people fit in. Also, create the great man theory. So Shakespeare is bigger than Ben Jonson and Marlowe. 'Cause Shakespeare stood on his own and had no influence from Marlowe and Ben Jonson. That was impossible. He was a genius on his own. And Gutenberg, he was a genius on his own. He did not need all of those dirty Chinese and Koreans or the Egyptians to create the printing press. What are you talking about? So let's summarize. William Shakespeare did not create the 5-act play. He was retconned after his death, and the most likely suspect is Ben Jonson, who was much more colorful and interesting than Shakespeare. And then from them to the 19th century, there were a plethora of ideas about what the plot driver could be at the center of stories, which were then hotly debated. My dear sir, could you tell me what is at the center of stories? Morality, emotion, realism, sense, or sensibility? Shall we debate it? And there was no talk about conflict being at the center of stories. Not yet. No. They retconned that in. So next time I'll re-meet you for Gustav Freytag, one of the great retconners that partially explains why Shakespeare and Aristotle are misunderstood on story structure. So subscribe and hit that bell notification so I can get 100 subscribers and change the unruly URL of this channel. Or don't subscribe. Like or hate the video, but if you're going to debate, leave reliable sources in a way that we can verify. And just generally comment so the YouTube gods see me. Thank you. Engagement, just a little bit would be good. So read more, explore more, see more, love more literature. Let literature light up your world. See you next time. And yeah, William Shakespeare was ableist from a contemporary POV, but I kind of think the separation of your head from your body might be a good motivation to not go against the popular narrative. But beyond that, I think the reason people love to invoke William Shakespeare over Ben Jonson is because Shakespeare is mysterious and kept his head down, which is a good thing to do when you know you have a wife at home with twin daughters. But I personally think paratext-wise, at least Ben Jonson is a much more entertaining character to look at, and that's the person I'd choose to hang out with. The person willing to piss off Queen Elizabeth I and be thrown into jail is more like the type I'd like to talk to. I also have thoughts that through to the 19th century, I love the fact that they were willing to debate and allow for a variety of stories and story types, experiment, and instead of pushing away all the influx of ideas due to new education, embrace them and debate them fully. How lively those dining rooms must have been in Europe and the Americas. Imagine Dumas Jr. arguing with his ghostwriters about proper forms. Only we could have a slight peek at such lively conversations. But now it's been summarily flattened. And doesn't that make you sad?